All right, welcome everybody back to another video here by Top Comics Pressing. In this video, what I want to do is walk you through all of the eras of comic books from the Golden Age through the Modern Age and try to highlight some of the structural differences that one wants to be aware of and consider when working on comic books from these different eras. So what I have here is a small selection of Golden Age books. At least for me, these are the oldest books in my collection and are some of the most prized books in my collection as well. For those of you who follow the CGC census, you'll know that Golden Age books tend to be quite a bit lower census count and quite a bit rarer than Silver Age books. To me, a Golden Age book is really anything that predates kind of the late 1950s. So 1958 or so or earlier. I know that doesn't follow most strict definitions, but I use that guideline not due to any political issues like introducing the comic book code, but instead I focus on how the book is constructed and what kinds of material and how it feels and looks and the size of it. So right off the bat here, I'm going to go ahead and start with the Detective Comics number 80. I happen to know that this book already has a detached cover, and so I don't want anybody to freak out or accuse me of damaging the book. But I did choose it because it has a single wartime staple. So that's referred to as the wartime staple when there was one staple in the middle of the book instead of having staples on either side. And this book is really awesome, coming from 1943, and so it was one that I was very excited to be able to add to my collection. You'll notice books of this era have the indicia, all that really important fine print, on the inside front cover, and so this one clearly says 1943, and it's a really nice copy, at least from my point of view, from a Golden Age book. So because the cover is already detached, I'm just going to go ahead and slide the cover off. And at least for a book from my PC, I kind of like this because I then can separate the inner wraps of the book from the back cover. And you'll notice the back cover is kind of entertaining here. You can tell that this flap was folded over and it has a distinct tanning on one side, and you can kind of see the alternate tanning on the back cover as well. And so these covers tend to be quite fragile. Sometimes they're brittle. They can break unexpectedly or crack. But what you'll notice is that the inner wraps of this book actually look quite bright. And this is not uncommon for Golden Age books where the cover might have a lot of defects, but the inner pages on that thick, heavy newsprint are quite vibrant and still quite readable. And for that reason, I kind of like books like this for my personal collection because I can gently set the cover aside and read the gripping tale here of Two-Face and his Liberty dollar. So as you flip through this, you'll notice again the colors are bright. It's very, very readable, and it's all in all a really nice story. On the front half of the book, you'll notice it's devoid of the gripper tears on the back. And for those of you that don't regularly look at or don't have access to Golden Age books, what's really cool about them is you get a lot of stories all in one book. So in a modern book, you might have to collect a dozen or more comics to get a complete story arc. All of these Golden Age books are very short stories. They're very readable. So this is a 12-page Two-Face tale here. And then you get something else. So here's Slam Bradley, and this is a tale of football. And so we have very 1940s era football stories. You'll come up with tears. So this is a true tear up into the page. But these little tears down at the bottom are from the gripper that pulled it through in the press. And so you'll see those on all of the pages later on in here. And that's a manufacturing issue. That's not a defect to the comic book. And then we have the Crimson Avenger. And so again, you have the gripper tears, but the colors are quite bright. It's very readable. And you should clear your calendar if you have the opportunity to sit down and read these because there is a lot of text and a lot of dialogue. So I put a Silver Age backing board in the center fold. That's what I was slowly flipping to here. So you can see that there is a single staple. There's not staple holes above and below it. So that's the single wartime staple. During World War II, we were trying to conserve metal. And so to do that, we decided to staple one in the middle instead of two on the outside. I put the Silver Age backer board in the middle just to help support this book, even though you know, it's in a fullback, so this is another fullback board here to help support it. What you'll notice with the Golden Age books is they are physically larger than their Silver Age counterparts. So here's a Silver Age book, and if I line that up to the inner wraps, you'll notice that there's a very wide border on the edge where that book is exposed. So if you do encounter a Golden Age book in the wild, I suggest you measure it. It was not uncommon to trim them and try to slim off some defects in edge chipping. And so definitely measure it up with either another Golden Age book from the same publisher, or try to look up what are the suggested dimensions online to make sure. I have received trimmed copies bought online and had to return them, so that's disappointing. As I've already mentioned a couple times, these are World War II era books, and so you can see here that they're encouraging citizens to buy war bonds and war stamps. DC was a little bit more tame about its war propaganda than Timely, which has a number of stories that are very, very direct in terms of trying to support the war effort and vilify the Axis powers. But the theme in the DC books to buy bonds and stamps does translate through most of the text. And there are a couple of really epic Batman tales that have some hysterical costumes and hats and things in them that are all World War II themed. So these are really fun to read. Again, you'll notice each one of these stories has a different author, a different artist, and a different theme. So here we have a little bit of a military theme inside that Batman detective, and there we are at the end. So all in all, a very cool comic book, and I really wanted to highlight that wartime staple, as well as, you know, just how bright and supple and easy to read these books still can be today, especially if treated very diligently. So next up here, I have a Batman number 31. This is going to be a contrast from that detective book. So in this particular case, I'm not going to take this one out of the bag. And I encourage you, if you come across a Golden Age book that you haven't, you know, written notes for or inspected yourself, that you take a few seconds to look at it through the bag before you quick pull it out. In this particular case, you can tell this issue is quite fragile. So it has a pretty big chunk missing here, but you can see even that little fleck must have come off since I put it in the bag last time and rolled over. And I can see that there's another chunk right there that's just waiting to dislodge. As you look at the bottom edge here, you can see that there's a good amount of chipping and some pieces missing. There's a spine split that's starting, and both these staples look like they are about ready to come loose. And so you can kind of tell just by looking at the lateral tears. And so this book, if I pulled it out and messed with it, would have a serious risk of detaching the cover. And so books of this era, particularly if you see signs of potential damage, sometimes are best left not working on. So if I think about the grade of this comic, pressed or unpressed, it's going to be the same because of the pieces that it's missing. I'm not really going to help it out with eye appeal much. I might be tempted to maybe try a really light dry clean in this area around Batman's face, but probably not. I think I would probably leave this one as is, and if a client brought me this book, I would likely decline it for work, just because there's more damage I could do to it than help. And so that's an important line. Here's a classic EC Hanging Man cover. These have gotten to be very popular, all the pre-code horror books. This one is equally in rough shape. So if you look very carefully at the corner and along this edge here, let's see if I can lift it up, you can see that the spine is already starting to split. That staple looks detached. This staple, if it is attached, is holding on by a mere thread, but it's most likely already detached. As you look across the top here, you can see that the back cover shows through, and it's not lined up with the inner wraps, and so that tells you again that that cover is probably detached even without looking at it. You can see that the wraps don't line up with each other, and so this book is going to have a lot of structural problems. And if I were to pull it out of here, we'd probably leave a few pieces of it on the table, and so I'm going to leave that one in the bag and board as well, really just highlighting that you want to take a quick glance and look at these things over and use some better judgment, particularly with these older Golden Age books. This one, on the other hand, I'm going to open up. I got this book for a very low price, and looking at it and recognizing the popularity of EC Comics, you might ask how I got this one for a deal. Well, I always tell people to flip comics over, make sure you're not shy to ask folks to pull something out of a bag and board before you buy it. And the reason for that is this back cover. Now, just having the cover piece missing is okay. That's going to limit the grade quite considerably, but it won't be super detrimental. What really kills the technical grade and value of this particular copy is the chunk missing out of this wrap. If you flip it over, you can see that there's just a little bit of text missing, only a few letters. But those few letters do technically interrupt the story, and so this book is technically incomplete. Because the story is interrupted by a missing piece. And so that's really tragic, but in my case it was quite awesome because I was able to purchase this that I might not have otherwise been able to do. And I wanted to highlight something else about this book. First off, it still is a little bit larger than its Silver Age counterpart over here, and so you can see again that there's a good amount of black that's missing. It does on its first glance possibly look trimmed, and the way I bring that up is if I look at how these inner pages are appearing, this gap looks to me to be larger than that gap up there, and so that might indicate that somebody trimmed it in a crooked manner. But I don't actually think this book is trimmed, and the reason for that is if I look at the cover, you'll notice it's tight up top, but it is slightly off at the bottom, and so I believe that this was just slightly miswrapped and cut. And I have further evidence that this book was mismanufactured because while it does have a very clear staple right here, it does not have a bottom staple. And it's not that that bottom staple is stapled on the back or stapled on the side. It actually was never there to begin with. And you can tell because there are no holes for it and there's no pieces missing. And if we flip through all of this beautiful text, by the way, I'm holding underneath in the center of the spine with my hand cupped so that the spine rolls in there and I don't open it all the way up to stress it out. But you can see all the wonderful pre-code content here. And again, you know, for the Golden Age books, just look at how much text there is in here compared to a modern. So, you know, I think some people, when they hear folks say, you know, I learned to read from comics or something, and you go grab a modern book, you might not believe that that's true. But if you look at the amount of text on this page, it's absolutely remarkable. And so if we flip here very carefully to the centerfold, again, totally readable, very vibrant colors, very clear. All right, here we are at the centerfold, and so now you can see very clearly that there is one top staple firmly secured, but there is no hole, there is no bottom staple, there's no puncture marks of any kind, and so this was simply a manufacturing defect. But you'll see again those gripper tears, so these are very common. All of this is manufacturing damage on the interior. All right, so that sums up the Golden Age books. You know, when you're fortunate enough and lucky enough to encounter one of these books, I really encourage you to treat it as carefully as possible. Carefully ask yourself if there's more harm than good coming from you working on a book like this, especially if it's tanned. You know, you can crack pieces off of it or lose flakes just by touching it, and so you want to be very, very careful of that. Okay, moving on to the Silver Age. This is probably, for Marvel fans, the most important era of comics. Of course, it is the dawning of Stan Lee's Marvel Age and the introduction of many of the most iconic characters of the MCU. Here we have 4 books. I've selected these for a couple of reasons. And, you know, we've already established that these books are slightly smaller than the Golden Age books. Almost all of the Marvel books have the exact same construct, that is 32 interior pages, and they have a cover then that is not counted in those 32 pages. That differs from the Golden Age books, where if you see something like a 52-page magazine declared on this Batman book, which is significantly larger than the 32 in the Silver Age, that 52 really means 48 because they counted the front and the back cover and the interior front and the interior back cover. And so if you're counting pages on these, you want to be aware that that 52 really means 48, and that really then, you know, you cut that by 1/4 to get the full number of wraps that are there. But certainly if you're counting pages, you should always have an even number of pages. And so that's something to be aware of and very mindful of. And we'll get to that in the grading video as well. All right, so the Silver Age books, like I said, all have the same 32 pages with the exception of the square bounce. And so I can pull this one out. I selected this one because the corner piece here is missing. And so you can actually get a pretty good indication of how this was constructed from that missing chunk. So the way that these fatter square bounds worked is that they bundled together the inner wraps just like they would normally do, and then they stacked them, and then they glued a cover around the outside of those. And I'll show you the inside of a What If #1 here in a little bit. This one is quite delicate, and so I don't want to pull this one out and mess with it, other than to show you, you can see all the bundling of those inner wraps, and then imagine how they were glued together in the square bound. Square bounds are a little bit more delicate and challenging to press. We'll get that into a video. I've done a number of square bounds, both modern as well as going back to the Silver Age, and there's a number of tips and tricks you definitely want to get on your side before attempting those. Going back to the main Silver Age issues here, again, we want to be very careful to check books out fully before sending them for grading. So this Dr. Octopus first appearance here is an epic Silver Age key, but it's not one that's ever going to make it into a CGC slab, at least not in my hands, because it has really bad staining on that splash page. But you can see, the colors in general are bright. It again is quite readable. And so this is the full Steve Ditko glory here, introducing one of the great villains of the Marvel era. And very great interior colors. Again, very bright. And this newsprint is very durable and readable. So I know some people get really worried about handling and reading books of this era, but if you're careful with them, you can totally enjoy them in their original form and content, and so that's quite wonderful on this book. I did want to just show you the staining, and we'll come back to this book here in a moment. The other thing about these is the Silver Age of Marvel is notorious for these staples. So I pulled out two here that have really bad staple jobs. You'll notice on both of these the staple is pointing up at you, and it's not coming in at the side of the comic like it's supposed to. It's equally as common on this era of Marvel to have the staples actually on the back cover. And if you're pressing these, that staple placement is something you want to pay very close attention to make sure that when you're sliding in material as a buffer, that you don't push that material right through those staples. That would be very problematic and very disappointing. You'll also notice that there's a good amount of the interior wraps that are exposed here on this comic. That is normal, and I would call this within tolerance for a book of this era from Marvel. You can try to fix the spine roll, but you're going to end up doing more damage than good. And you'll notice, the spine is pretty tight. The issue is just the staples were misplaced, and because of that, the pages were miscut a little bit, and that leads to that difference in the wrap. And so this one doesn't have anything to fix, really. It's also another one where pressing it isn't going to do a whole lot of good. The same is true here. You've got some staples that again are pointing out at you. Both those staples have a little bit of staple rust, and if you flip it over, in general, it looks really nice. It just got kind of a big tear there. But then again, these inner wraps are kind of exposed, but the cover lines up pretty well. And so this is another example of a book I wouldn't monkey with the spine on, particularly with those staples, and it's not really going to move the technical grade. This one I just had out here because it's got tape on it, and I needed another Spider-Man book. Okay, so that does it for the Silver Age, especially within Marvel. These will all press up quite nice if you want to press them up. But again, they're probably some of everybody's favorite, and the colors in them generally can still be quite bright and quite readable. I mean, this is really amazing how clear this comes through for how old of a book that this is. Some beautiful Don Heck work here. Very, very nice work, and a very clean interior. Okay, so I consider the Silver Age to be kind of that 1958 to roughly 1968 era. Once you get between 1968 and 1974, you're in kind of a new construction of paper. You'll notice that these books still are physically the same size as those Silver Age books, so they have the same width, give or take, they have the same height. Usually you can distinguish them based on the cover price. So the Silver Age ones tend to be 10 cents or 12 cents, whereas this next generation is the 20 cents and maybe occasionally a 25 cents. These books of this era have very different temperament when you're actually working with them, particularly if you're doing stain removal and whitening. Books of this era have just the worst gloss ever, and any amount of moisture will just clean off that gloss. And so it gets to be very obvious that they were stained. So I've worked on a number of Marvel Spotlight 5s, as well as Hero for Hire 1 are very popular books from this era. And those books are very challenging to get stains out of and make look presentable. And I'll walk you through some of that. So this Amazing Spider-Man 109 has what I would call some true tanning here. And I've pulled that out on purpose so that we can kind of see it. Let me just slide this over and carefully lay that down. That tanning is the dark border here with a very nice light interior. So if you look only at this section of the book, it looks quite naturally aged, maybe a little bit of creamy, but still quite white. This dark border here is going to be true tanning, and that true tanning is going to be a problem for people's oppressor. It's also going to create problems for stain removal and whitening techniques. It's not impossible, but it's going to be a problem. And the paper is going to be a lot more brittle. So if you look really carefully down here, you're going to see there's a chunk missing, and that's not surprising for a book with this level of true tanning. And that tanning gets really bad when you start to see white speckles in the really dark area, or if it looks even more burnt than this. So this is moderate. It's not super bad, but it definitely is getting up there. And if you flip it over, you can see not only does it have some staining on the rear, but you have a very clear dust shadow along here of that tanning. And again, the back cover is going to have that same kind of toasted marshmallow burnt edge. And then this one is conveniently nice and white right by the guy's whitey tighties right in the middle. But you can see the edge looks quite rough. So that'll be it for that one. What I did want to mention though is that this Amazing Spider-Man 111, has both a curl, but it has that same staple problem. And actually this Amazing Spider-Man back here that we just talked about, the 109, also has really poor staple placement on the back. And so this staple placement is a common problem, not just for Silver Age, but also moving into the early 70s of these Marvel books. Getting them where they're on the side, it can be difficult. When they're on the side, that's your best bet for pressing. But you'll notice those staples are off, but there's no spine roll or anything like that to fix on this one. This issue, though, does have pretty bad exposure of the inner wraps. It might have a very slight spine roll. I mean, you can see some white here, but it's not too bad. This is mostly manufacturing. So to fix that, what you'd have to do is flatten the book out and then fold it back over and drag. You're going to end up dragging some of this front cover onto the back cover, given how wide that is. So this is one where I probably wouldn't even bother. What I did want to show you on this one, though, is this is kind of a normal look for books of this cover on the top. This is not foxing. Let's see if I can lift it up there and get some lighting. It has that light speckled kind of creamy look to it. And that is just how books of this very narrow range of the early 70s look. And it really distinguishes them from their books only a couple years later. So there you go. Now, right about 1974, those books are tweener books. So the tweener books include, though, 2 mega keys. So Amazing Spider-Man 129, as well as the Incredible Hulk 180. Both have the same size of this book, but they have the cover material and construction of books a few years later. And what distinguishes the early 70 books from those 1974 and 1975 line is that the covers get significantly thinner, but they also get much thicker gloss by comparison. And that gloss makes them a lot easier to work and handle with. And you can see that while this one has that speckled look all the way throughout, which is not true foxing, it's not foxing, that's just aging. Books of this era now all of a sudden look quite sharp, and that's the difference of the material construction. So again, 1974 is this size, but it has the materials of this book, and so that makes the Amazing Spider-Man 129 and Hulk 181 quite unique, but they're 2 big keys right at that junction. All right, once we get to 1975, the books shrink a little bit, and all of a sudden we end up with some pretty robust manufacturing, at least robust as far as comic books go. So if you are new to pressing, I would encourage you to go find some books from the early 80s. Usually they're not too expensive. You can find some practice books that are in mid-grade. Often you can find some that have some nice defects that are quite pressable. And what's cool about the books of this era is roughly from that 1975 all the way through about 1995 to 1998, the books are basically the same. So they have the same number of pages as the Silver Age books, but they have that thinner cover, and they have still newsprint on the interior pages, which is quite nice. In addition to that, you know, they don't really suffer the same problems that the books only a couple of years earlier do when it comes to stain removal and whitening. And so this is by far and away my favorite era of books to work on. They press up really nicely. They're fun to do the stain removal and whitening on because they make some really jaw-dropping pictures, and they're a great place to start as a beginner. Now you might ask why I'm differentiating these from, let's say, a brand new modern book, because these books, which are new, and somewhere in the 90s this started to happen, early 2000s it was kind of 50-50, but all the modern books now that are true moderns have a glossed interior instead of this newsprint interior. So if you compare these two, you can see a very clear difference on the material construction on the inside, and that's going to make a really big difference on how we press, because these you can heat hotter, you can kind of abuse them with humidity. The glossed pages here, especially because they're so thin by comparison, these will stick together and you'll fuse them. So too much pressure, too much heat, when you pull it out of your press, it'll be a brick and all the pages will be physically stuck together and you won't be able to flip through the pages without carefully trying to separate them. Also a big difference if you get to irons, because or when we get to tacking irons, because it's really easy to fuse the pages of these true moderns. This, by the way, happens to be one of my favorite Batman stories. It's an epic two-parter where the Joker invents the laughing fish to try to get rich. And so it's a fantastic two-part Batman story with some absolutely amazing art. And I just highly recommend this story a lot. So it's a personal favorite. This one, I think, is the first appearance of Yoda. If we flip to the... yeah, here we go. Yep. That looks like a little green Jedi, so pretty cool. I've been lucky enough to find a couple of copies of this one. These whiten up great, and it doesn't look unnatural for a book of that age. And again, that interior construction just makes these a lot easier to iron. It makes them a lot easier to press, and so great spot to start. Now, every era since the 60s does have some of these square bounds, and so I wanted to take a second to walk you through that. This happens to be a What If 1. Other books that are square bound are Giant Size X-Men #1. A lot of the Giant Size books, period, are square bound. The original run of the Silver Surfer is also square bound. These have that same construction that I showed earlier, but if you open them up, you can actually see the staples on this one. So here you can very clearly see the top and the bottom staple on the interior. That's really annoying when you press, because you don't want to push those staples through the front cover or the back cover. And also it makes a problem for you to try to get good results between the staples and the spine. So again, they're there. These would be more of those grippy tear problems, and that problem persists all the way through the 90s. So for those of you that have had more than one copy of Amazing Spider-Man 361, many of those have that same manufacturing defect, just to be aware of. The square bound issue that I was referring to, and let's see if I can hopefully get it, but right here by that staple, you can see that space between the staple and the spine is always going to have that weird sunken look to it. And you can kind of see it in the glare. So every time I press one of these, it looks, yeah, it's really bad on the bottom on this copy. But there's not much you can do as a presser between that space between the staple and the spine. Sometimes you can lightly use a tacking iron to flatten it out, but generally these square bounds all have what looks like some defects and rippling, particularly around that staple. CGC has been generous to me, and I have not seen a grader note complaining about that yet. So don't get too worried about that. It's just a function of how the book is created. All right, here we have a small spattering of some true modern books. And these, by comparison to Silver Age books, weigh a ton because they are more plastic than paper. They're heavily glossed on the interior, and they are quite dense. So if you ever get a collection of Silver Age books, feel free to pick up a whole long box of Silver Age. You can toss it around. It's not too heavy. If you get a long box of Moderns, it weighs a ton by comparison. So just something to be aware of. Obviously, lots of very popular characters have been introduced in the last 20 years in Marvel and Star Wars. And so we just want to keep an eye out for those key books. And I'll draw your attention to some of the things in modern books that can cause a problem. So probably the most important of which is the staples. And I selected this book and the Star Wars book to share with you because the staples are absolutely gigantic. So you can see exactly how big these are in this Spider-Gwen #1. This is a problem if you don't do your stack and your buffer right, because they will end up getting pushed right through your cover, and you'll see a huge imprint on the staple right here. The other thing that goes wrong with these, and this was the Victim book that I selected for this. Again, very huge staples on the interior here of this book. And if we flip it over, one of the most common defects on true moderns is going to be slight color rub by the staples. And the way you get that is by having somebody take their bag with their board, and they will put the board in the bag, then they'll take their comic book, and then they will just drop it in. And that is going to be a no-no, because that is going to create friction as that comic slides on the board. And when you do that, you're going to end up with the color rub on the back. So what I encourage you to do instead is hold this and then slide it in together so that you do not cause that color rub. Okay, by contrast, I selected this Ultimate Fallout 4 because the staples in this one and that Darth Vader are gigantic, but that is not universally true. So if we check this out, we have very small staples on the inside of this book. And so you need to adjust your stack when pressing to account for that difference in staples between the gigantic ones in here and the very small ones that are in here. The other very common thing to watch out for is the pesky digital code. Let's see if we can find that in this one. So there it is. This is the free digital copy code for Marvel, and that's going to be pretty lame because if you don't adjust your stack right, you're going to end up with a square right here on the back in the glare from using too much pressure and not buffer in the right spots. And so that's something you want to watch out for sure. Okay, that gets us up to the most modern moderns. There are a few other things that you might be interested in pressing, so magazines could be some of those, and so we can bring out our favorite couple of magazines. These are going to be larger than even the Golden Age books, so if I go back to my Golden Age Batman here and I put that over the magazine, it's pretty clear that the magazine is larger yet than that. The Golden Age Batman's pretty close, but that Ninja Turtle book is oddly tall by comparison, and so it's technically a magazine size. That's how you have to submit it to CGC. It has the magazine height. These magazines can come in stapled, which is what the Star-Lord one here is, or they can be square bound. So I've pressed a few Nintendo Powers for people, and those end up being square bound style press. Very cool though, still to be able to pick up and read these older magazines. First appearance of Star-Lord in this one, and the Ninja Turtle one is a classic book for anybody to read. This one happens to be a mid-grade third printing if you look at the interior, but I always like to point out to people that this is dedicated to Jack Kirby and Frank Miller, and so if you didn't know that, that is your trivia question of the week that you can ask somebody else. Always just a true joy to be able to open these up and flip through the original art of what are now some very iconic, very long-lasting characters in the Ninja Turtles. So very cool art, very Frank Miller inspired storyline and grit, and very Jack Kirby style artwork. I mean, you can see the kind of leaping out of the page literally here, even on the first big splash page. It's very Kirby inspired. So very cool book. This one I did press, and I have before and after pictures posted on my Flickr as well as the Facebook. So that one is a personal copy. So the last category of book here I want to talk about are these treasury editions. These things are fantastic if you're a fan of comic books, because you can open them up and they are just epically huge. They're larger than life, and so you can see some of just really amazing artwork. And what's really great about it is you can get your nose right in there and literally stick your head inside the comic book. And so that's really awesome to be able to see these. The downside is these are too big for my press, and so I don't work on these, and they're too big for CGC or CBCS to encapsulate. So I believe CBCS does offer quote raw grades on these, where they'll put them in an outer well, but they don't actually put them in a hard plastic slab. But they are very cool books to be able to open up and stick one's nose in. All right, so I hope that you've enjoyed the video here, going all the way from the golden age to the modern age with some of the distinctions of these materials. And we'll address how to press these quite differently in upcoming videos. I just wanted to point out a lot of the structural features and differences of these books, and thank you for your time. Please go ahead and like, subscribe, etc.